and Australia, who the time zones being not conducive to joining us today, Chris Sohn and others. So it'll be recorded and they can be put up on the website, they can access it. The next few conversations are being developed in collaboration with the Global Journal of Community Psychology Practice. And I don't know if Nicole will be able to join us, the editor, Nicole Freund. And their upcoming special issues, they have 3 of them coming out this spring. One on racial justice and anti-racist praxis, one on decoloniality, and one on defining the definition, revisiting the definition of community psychology practice. For each one of those, we're going to hold a conversation, and it's not exactly clear what those dates will be. And all will involve revisiting the original areas that were called competencies and being responsive to the demands that were put forth by the Black community psychologists and CIRA last year. Susan Wolf, who's here, the president-elect of SCRA, will facilitate the work that follows in terms of the redefinition. So this discussion will not fall on deaf ears. Today, we're going to we're usually 60 minutes. We're going to go to 90 minutes with the last 30 minutes committed to, based on the wonderful discussion we're going to have with our 3 presenters, how do we relook at the issues of the definitions of racial justice and anti-racist practice in our present documents. They are the editors of this very special issue, and I've seen the table of contents. It's really quite amazing. They're going to present, and they'll be followed by questions, and then taking extra time to discuss that. So let me introduce. Okay, I'll start by introducing Jerry, because she's the one who's here. Jerry Palmer is both a scholar, practitioner, and a scholar activist, educator, and writer. She serves as the managing director of Community Wellness Institute and an adjunct faculty member of both Adler University and National Louis. Jessica Fernandez is the assistant professor of ethnic studies department at Santa Clara University. She's a community engaged researcher whose work centers on decolonial feminist epistemologies and participatory action research, paradigms to support and cultivate youth, Latinx and community agency, liberation, transformative justice, and social political well-being. And Dominique Thomas is the editor of The Community Psychologist. He received his BA from Morehouse and his MA and PhD in community psychology from Georgia State. He's interested in Black identity, racial socialization, activism, Afrofuturism, and Black students' experiences with campus racial climate. Dominique, Jessica?
Hi,
Jerry,
good morning.
Oh,
Hi.
there you are. Great. So I don't know what your plan was for who was going to present when, but I'll turn it over to you and you'll go from there. That work?
Great. Yes. Thank
Great.
you. Thank you so much for organizing this this gathering, and thanks to everyone who is joining us near and far, wherever you are. We really appreciate and value your time and your commitment to engage in these conversations. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jerry, who has been leading SARA since SARA got ignited. I'll invite Jerry to say a little bit more about SARA, who we are and what we do. And then we'll move into talking a little bit about the themes for the special issue that I can give more context about and share more as to how this special issue came about and what are the core themes that we're hoping to highlight in the articles that will be contributing to this special issue.
Okay. Yep. Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate it. And I thank everyone as well for joining us this morning, and for Tom and Susan, who put this together and brought the conversation to us about possibly coming on and sharing more about the special issue. And as Jessica shared, a little bit about SARA, and some of you know about Sarah. But before I move into that, I also want to acknowledge the land that I'm on at the moment, and we're looking at that. Acknowledging Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Miami, Sioux, and the Peoria lands. And so we give that acknowledgement and honor over to being on this space at the moment. And so to that end, so I came aboard Sarah in maybe 2017, if I'm not mistaken, and it had been dormant for a moment. With think there were leadership that had a number of other commitments, et cetera. And so when I stepped in, Jessica did as well as the chair, or started serving as the chair, and Jessica as the co-chair. Sarah had, been established to advance culture and ethnic racial affairs, basically for members of SCRAW and all of the I would say, components that revolve around what that might look like through through a committee at that particular time. And so Yolanda Suarez Balcazar was instrumental, as well as a number of other members at the time: Jessica, myself, Dominique, Anne Marie Beals. And definitely, I'm not trying to name, everyone, but we were worked together to move Sarah from a committee to a council. And so that was great because that gave Sarah voting rights, and we were able to attend EC meetings, et cetera, and a number of other places or spaces we were able to be in at that point. And so, we've moved it forward to this day. We started an e-newsletter called the Sarah e-newsletter, and issued a number of statements regarding all the issues around the world in terms of advancing racial justice practice and so forth. And so, that's been great. And so we moved into this space, though, of course, as many of you know, I don't even have to say as many of you, but all of us primarily are aware of the issues in 2020 and even before 2020 ever occurred. And so, of course, we, as everyone has, just become centered really on stepping up and moving into a space where we are integral. I would say we are, looking to be uh, and to look to or go to in this space where, we are advancing anti-Blackness practices, denouncing white supremacy and anti-racist issues. And so, that's a little bit about Sarah, just overall, I think the gist of it. And so then we came around the corner to this point where, and I'm going to turn this back over to Jessica. I believe it was Nicole who approached us, Nicole Fruin, the editor of the GJCPP, about possibly doing a special edition or doing a special edition around the issues of anti-racist and anti-Blackness practices, et cetera. And it was an appropriate moment in time. We had just come off of the incidents with George Floyd, if I'm not mistaken, and Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. And I say those three in this space, but always remembering that list is long regarding these concerns and these issues. And so, of course, we were, looking to, not looking, but agreed right away to do that, because we also were just thinking about coming into a group writing for resistance and recognizing that it certainly is a way to advance the work that we were doing, and a dominant way to do that, in essence, because of how vast and wide we could push forward our space. We could push forward the agenda, getting out to the global community as well as communities in the United States. And so that was a place where we readily agreed to do so. So Jessica has been fearlessly leading this effort. I know she's probably pretty tired by now with the manuscripts and the back and forth and such, but it's going to be beautiful. And I look forward to it myself. So I'm going to hand this back over to you, Jessica, to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And thank you as well for reminding me about the importance of acknowledging land, place, and where we stand. And so I want to, preface what I'll say about the special issue by acknowledging the land on where I stand, which is a land that belongs rightfully to the Ohlone and the Muwekma Ohlone people, who are the rightful owners and protectors of this land that is known as the Silicon Valley here in San Jose, Santa Clara County, where I strive to work to decolonize my ways of knowing and being, and particularly Santa Clara University, that is a mission institution that has a legacy of genocide and violence. And so with that, I bring my whole self and presence into the complexities of colonialism that we still live and confront today. And that also really served as a foundation for the work to decolonize and to interrogate and unsettle whiteness within community psychology and within the ways in which we were seeing the discipline not fully acknowledge the assemblages of racial violence at its intersections. And so that really set the foundation, as Jerry described, for this special issue. And in this special issue, we specifically wanted and invited community psychologists and allies within our allied disciplines to consider three key questions. One, what is racial justice and what does it look like within and outside of community psychology? Again, this is in the context of a broader sociopolitical context under an administration that was incredibly violent and grotesque in its discourse and its policies and its practices. And so we really wanted us to engage with this question of racial justice. What does it look like inside and outside of community psychology? The second question was, how is racial justice engaged and practiced among our communities, acknowledging very well that communities themselves have power, have agency, and have been fighting the good fight much, much longer than some of us often give them credit for as practitioners and as researchers. They themselves have power. So that was the second question. And the third one was, to what extent and in what ways has the discipline advanced racial justice and for whom? So again, really orienting the special issue to developing and understanding the repertoire of practices and skills that among our community of practitioners and scholars, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color within our field, have been engaging in this kind of work for quite some time, and often doesn't get the kind of spotlight and credit that it really merits and deserves. And so with those three key questions, we send out the call for papers, and then at its core, this special issue has three interconnected goals and values, which is really to feature the work of practitioners, emerging scholars, scholar activists of color, as well as those in institutional affiliations and positions that are often underrepresented, such as HBCUs, HSIs, and community colleges. Really, again, decolonizing and decentering the role of the academy, specifically of R1 institutions, and really centering the voices that need to be centered, making space for that. And so through this special issue, we're really hoping to do three things. One is to feature examples of community psychology practice that demonstrate racial justice and an anti-racist praxis. So not just the thinking about racial justice, but also the doing it, both within the US, but also outside the US, acknowledging that, racial formations are not unique to the US. They have manifestations of various forms across the globe. Two, to highlight research, specifically studies that have participatory action research components or other decolonial feminist methodologies that are also inclusive of Indigenous and traditional ways of knowing and documenting knowledge, and that have been used to uplift and affirm community strengths. And then the third and last goal is to expand and build upon community psychology theories by integrating and making space for critical race theory perspectives, feminist intersectional perspectives, that really attend to the racial formations or racialized structures of power and oppression within various institutions and systems. So not only making an intervention in terms of the ways in which racial justice is practiced, documented, and engaged within the discipline, but also make space for other theories and perspectives that our discipline has not fully acknowledged or recognized as valuable, such as critical race theory, intersectionality, Black feminist thought, women of color feminisms, and similar perspectives. So that's really what's animated this special issue and our efforts to bring it into being, really with the contributions and the commitment by all of the contributing authors. Currently, we have 15 contributing authors. We have 15 articles, 15 manuscripts that will become a part of this special issue. And they include authors not just from the US, we have authors from Australia, from Canada, from Puerto Rico, who are doing really critical, important work on unsettling and interrogating whiteness and white supremacy, but also uplifting the voices and experiences of Black and Indigenous and Latinx communities, as well as talking about the various ways in which multi-ethnic and multiracial communities are coming together to form coalitions to really challenge and interrogate the assemblages of racial violence and racial capitalism. Some of these feature a little bit about some of the work that's unfolding in the context of the pandemic, but really this work is really oriented towards the greater goal of interrogating whiteness and white supremacy, and really speaking to what does it look like to engage in racial justice beyond just words. And so I'll stop there and open it up to our conversation and to our dialogue. I will say as well that I have to leave at the top of the hour, so my apologies for leaving 30 minutes before this gathering concludes. Thank you.
There's a hand up below you, Andrea.
Actually, that was clapping, but I actually am still really happy to say something. I think I'm really excited. I'm definitely very excited to see this this grow. I'm wondering if anyone can speak to, if anyone wanted to speak to why there might be like a lack of embracing things like critical race theory and intersectionality in SCRA. I've always wondered that as a doctoral student, because it just seems so natural to me that like we fully embrace and like uplift those kinds of approaches and things like participatory action research. And yet it's always been something that like is pushed as like a fringe part of the field for some reason. So yeah, that's my first thoughts.
Thank you so much, and Andrea, for asking that question and inviting us to think more deeply about our training and how we were trained and why we were trained in certain ways, and why and how certain theories and perspectives were not a part of that training. I can speak from my experience and say that part of my own training was formed really along the lines of liberation psychology and perspectives, critical community psychology perspectives from the majority world. And so grounded in the work of Ignacio Martín Baró, Maritza Montero, and those perspectives, while not necessarily explicit about race or racialization or even colonialism, they do talk about power and hierarchies in ways that when I started taking courses in critical race theory in Latin American and Latinx studies, I was then able to bring them together. So I was trained in graduate school by my own choosing in a more multidisciplinary way, in the sense that I was taking courses outside of psychology that allowed me to learn about women of color feminisms, feminist theory, decolonial theory, critical race theory. I'm not sure why it is that some departments, our discipline itself doesn't do more of this. And perhaps I will offer that it might have to do with a desire to, at least in community psychology, establish itself as a discipline. And if I may say so, perhaps community psychology has an identity problem of wanting to establish itself and its roots within psychology, and by doing so often overlooks the possibilities of what other fields and other disciplines and a more transdisciplinary perspective could offer to expand and grow and nuance and build the field and the discipline in ways that really speak to the material and lived experiences of communities. Um, so I'll offer that as based on my own experience. And I invite others as well to share, please. Jerry, I most certainly don't want to be the one speaking here. This is a collective dialogue.
I agree. Thank you, Jessica. And certainly we open up the space for everyone's thoughts on this because it's one of the primary questions that we've been asking ourselves during this period of time. And I think we became aware, I'm saying we, meaning Jessica and I and Dominique as well, when we first started working to, put Sarah in a space where we could be instrumental in this work, uh, looking at some of the issues actually, or some of the challenges that people of color were having in Sarah and within the SCRAW community. And so what I think is maybe speaks to the question as well is part of Sarah and myself in this space is looking at how we develop critical consciousness, right? How we what that looks like, and as Jessica mentioned, looking at Paulo Freire's work in terms of that, and Frantz Fanon as well, the post-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon. And so looking at that, I think part of the special issue, or maybe even more than a part of it, and the work that we're doing is around this raising this level of awareness and this consciousness, right? And so I think that if that's not part of a curricular or part of academia, then that's not going to happen. So I think that going back to community psychology's establishment, as well as its growth through the years, that those voices weren't there. Those voices and weren't in the room in terms of what should that look like. And this is why it's critical to bring those voices into the space, because they're different and they have different ways of looking at things. The lens that we see through, the lived experiences have to be in the space, have to be in the room for uh, theories to come into play, like critical race and intersectionality, et cetera. So those they have to be in the room to do that, right? Like we're in the room now. And so we're appreciative of uh, uh, spaces like the one that we're holding here, because that really should have been what that should have looked like back in the 50s 60s at Swampscott, right? But it wasn't. So I speak to it from that way, um, and also offer that as a model for moving forward, is to ensure that we're centering and raising the voices of everyone, and looking at particularly everyone who has been in the trenches in say this country and globally as well, because they have lived experiences to offer. And if we're going to take that discipline out into the world, out into communities, as community psychology is put forward as a practice discipline, then we that's what it has to look like. And so I offer that as a way for moving forward and perhaps a lens at why we're here. Right.
Other people want to jump in?
Please.
I'll mention, Jerry brought up a really good point about us moving forward as a practice discipline, because that's been the other side. This has been a discipline that has been dominated by a white male dominant academic model of everything. Even the culture of SCRA very much mirrors that sort of white male academic culture. And I think that this is, to me, a breath of fresh air from moving this field where it needs to go. Because you talked about, Sarah needing to move from being committee to council. It reminded me of when practice also went through that process, because we didn't have a seat at the table either. And so I think that this field has a history of marginalizing anybody who isn't folded into the white male academic model. And they often blame it. Jessica mentioned that, sort of saying they needed to do this for legitimacy. Well, I know when Fairweather brought the program to Michigan State, he wanted to have it be sitting as a sort of a freestanding, drawing from multiple disciplines, and they wouldn't adopt it. He settled into the community psychology, into the psychology department there, because that was the only way they would even think of adopting the program. And of course, that to me is one of the programs that has really grown up in that traditional academic white male model of training and expectations for its students and socialization as well.
Kyra has an interesting comment in the chat. Can I invite you in, Kyra?
Hi, yes, sorry. I was having some connectivity issues, so I didn't want to be that, you see those commercials of the in and out. But yeah, I just wanted to just affirm Jessica and as well as Andrea's comment, and I guess as a follow-up to the comment that I originally wrote, was that I remember early on when I first started to get engaged with SCRA, and it was really like the practice council that I kind of had funneled into because of who my professors were. And I remember at that time, and that was 10 years ago, that there was this pushback around, accreditation and some type of organizing kind of body of sorts. And I don't quite know what that looks like now, but I think, especially when we get into conversations about competencies and, something that grounds, and I think that's been part of the problem too, is that, we have these broad principles, these broad values, but what does that mean? What does that look like? What does that mean for, your programs? What is it that we agree on that this is going to be, this kind of, what is it that we're going to agree on that we're going to do, and how we're going to think about things and assess things? And so my comments were just more so kind of affirmation to that, and just kind of sharing my thoughts on, maybe that being something that's a part of the reason why, we're at this point. And that question of, should we have to, because even with Jessica's experience of having, and I'm sure everybody else's, there's a difference, I think, between being a discipline that's interdisciplinary and being a quote unquote discipline where you have to actively on your own pull from other, spaces to enrich. I think there's a difference between those two things. And SCRA, the field of community psychology, has to decide who they want to be. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Kara, for sharing that. And for the closing question of deciding who we want to be. I think that's a big question. Cian, I see your hand. I'm not sure if that means you want to, please, everyone, we welcome you to speak. And
Thanks. Thanks so much, Jessica. And thanks so much for this, for fielding this great conversation and for the comment just now. I wanted to sort of build on that thought. And I'm wondering if there is any appraisal going on in SCRA in terms of our various programs, whether it's funding programs or the different ways in which we fund different streams, as well as just what SCRA does and the types of research that we prioritize in the conference. I just wondering if there's any kind of a desire to do an appraisal, because I think in order to cease perpetuating some of the dynamics that were named in terms of this being a very sort of colonial white male stream discipline, I think an appraisal is sort of necessary in terms of, you know, gauging where can we shift things, and pushing for that shift. I think there was a broad scale push by many academics of color, at least in the context that I work here in Canada, to basically sort of call out and name white colonial research, and when it's problematic, right? Because you have lots of researchers, white researchers in particular, who build their careers off the backs of marginalized communities with no intention of actually having that work go back to communities to do, you know, actual transformative work. And so that's a reality here in Canada. I'm sure it's a reality in your contexts as well. And if we have an entire community of folks through SCRA that want to see that shift, but we have an institution that continues to perpetuate that, I'm just wondering what's the incentive or motive, or is there any action to sort of shift that? And you know, yeah, what that can look like.
Thank you, Cian. I just wanted to share that therein lies a huge challenge when we have a community that wants to see a shift, but people are at hundreds of different universities, et cetera, and so that have a different framework or different, you know, structure that is being implemented at the moment, and so to that end, I think that's going to take a collective effort, but it's also going to take an individual effort for those who are at the universities or at the universities to go back and want that for the university as well, and not just here within SCRAW or within another outside community. That has to be a collective effort, or at least an effort of one individual to start the spark, right? And that's challenging. You know, that's challenging across the board when there's tenure involved, when there are a number of other facets that are, you know, that take place within universities, because it has its own living or own lived experience as well outside of the SCRAW community, and the adherence to those practices and you know, are there as well. And so it's no easy answers. There's no easy answers. It's a tremendous task when all of that is involved within this effort to decolonize, and an effort, you know, to bring a racial and social justice to the table. So we're not just contending with one organization and its nuances. We're contending with a much larger, and herein lies the systemic issues that, you know, we attempt to tackle. So it has a much larger face than right here. Right.
If I can hop in, thank you for everyone's feedback. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to stay steady in the conversation. I've been dipping in and out. But, you know, something I thought about, and Jerry and I have been in a really wonderful collective work of looking at decolonizing practice, not only in terms of institutional and decolonizing practice, but individual decolonizing practice. And I think if we look at institutions only without looking at individual decolonizing practice, we will, I think in many ways, not have a complete decolonial turn. So that's a challenge as well, especially if you're, you know, one of two people at your institution and you have no means to kind of do that work in practice personally and within the context of the institution, because there's no real foundation or real space for that. So, you know, my question is always, how do we build in spaces to do that work as collective, but within, but looking at our own journey with decolonialized practice, and how do we build those senses of that sense of community around that intention? And that to me is a necessary spark in order to really have the shared intention or collective intention that will feed into that decolonial term from an institutional perspective. And that's a bigger question that I don't think anybody can really answer. I think it's just a matter of our personal will and intention personally, but I think it's a necessary part of the work. And that's everybody. Everybody's got to do it. And I'm not talking about just white folks. We all got to do it, right? Because we are all infected with that bug. And we all have to define how we relate to it and acknowledge that it's in all of our systems. And how do we see ourselves differently in relationship to that? So I really hope that that's part of our intention moving forward as well. I am complete.
Yeah, Cian is bringing up, substantiating Deidre's point regarding that. I was just thinking about Frantz Fanon, and you know that he does well with that relationship between the colonized and the colonizer, right? And so, yeah, it is always in front of us, and I absolutely agree. Collectively, when we look at this thing, we have to keep in mind that we are part of the. Um, Sia said it well here about we're all trained in colonial institutions, or you know, reproducing that ideology in our institutions. And so the awareness is not just for others, you know, right? The awareness is right, is for, and that consciousness for everyone, because we're here continuously understanding critical consciousness. We're here holding this space because of that. Otherwise, you know, we would be what, last year this time, or not 2019, when these conversations weren't you know, even part of our space. So, you know.
Thank you, Deanne and Deidre and Jerry for sharing that. I absolutely resonate with everything you've shared. And part of the reason why it's so hard to do decolonial, anti-racist, racial justice work is because it really requires you introspecting, critical self-reflexivity, and interrogating your complicity and positionality and situativity within these legacies of colonialism and racial violence, and therefore coloniality, and then the process of decolonial undoing, and then anti-racist practice. And so it requires vulnerability, it requires interrogating the self to be able to engage in what Fanon describes as these reciprocal recognitions of our humanity. And that is really hard work at the individual, at the community, at the collective, at the systemic level. And everything that we've seen in this country, most definitely over the past year, has been a reckoning with that. And so, of course, it's going to produce individual unsettlement. But I'll leave it at that, because I can go on and on. But I do want to point out that decolonization and anti-racism are distinct, but are distinct and not but, and they're interconnected. Right? Decoloniality is a much broader umbrella for us to understand the various ways in which systemic power and oppression operate, with racialization being one of those dynamics. There's gender, there's sexuality, there's age, there's so much more under the decolonial turn. Anti-racism and racial justice is one element of that. Scott, I've seen your hand for some time now. Please join us.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks to you and Jerry and Dominique for your work on this special issue and raising this conversation within SCRA. You mentioned a reckoning a minute ago, and I think our program at University of Miami is going through our own kind of process of coming to grips with how we've been complicit in kind of maintaining some of these harmful systems and structures, and trying to go through our own process of figuring out what that means for our own culture, but probably more importantly, our own curriculum, the things that we're lifting up as important in the field and beyond, like you said, more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. I'm just curious for others, and I saw, heard Sion on there speak to issues in our discipline more broadly with SCRA, but I'm also thinking about a lot of this stuff gets perpetuated in programs. And even to Susan's comment about, the practice side, people get trained in academic programs, whether they're going into academia or going into the field. So the training is really important, and how programs kind of fashion their own training for students and what gets included and excluded as far as methods, epistemology, degrees of kind of criticality. All those things are really important. So I'm just kind of wondering, for those on this call, if you've had any success at in your programs, kind of making some changes, right? And maybe those changes can have ripple effects across our discipline. I'm open to ideas as we kind of embark on some of this work ourselves.
That's a good point, Scott. And I think about the possibility could stem from students themselves. And I teach clinical psychologists, actually community psychology, etc. But I will share that there around last year, this same time, um, a survey went forward regarding how does it feel to be a student of color, in particular Black African American, at the university. And so to that end, I think that was a spark that Deidre and I are referring to, that put forward change needed to happen. And I don't know that had that not occurred, and then of course, right off the heels of that, no, that happened in 2017, but a revised version came out, I think, in 2020, right after the incidents happened with George Floyd and or Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna. And so that reiterated the fact that change needed to occur. And so, that I offered that as a again, this spark for conversations to happen, because of course, when we look at the academy, we're looking at a forum or a container, so to speak, for students. And so if the students are unhappy, therein lies a challenge, right? That's an issue to be addressed, or that any university will likely address for their own well-being and staying afloat, et cetera. And so, to that end, perhaps that's room for a gathering of not just faculty who are interested in this work, but to put, something collective with the students as well, could be a high incentive for, administration, et cetera, to take a look at what can be done, to that end. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I do know that much change is happening from that particular um, level, from this I'm thinking about. Uh, I can't call it right now, but I know a number of students. Oh, I know what it is. They've got a call out from Washington University in St. Louis, around, this is their 30-year, 50-year, something to that year in anniversary when students put forward their concerns and their need for a Black Studies department. And I know this has happened across universities across the country to get those ethnic studies and started. And so that still I would believe or could see that being a model for this continued work as well, because it's not different from that. It's this continuation of the work that has been done these 30, 50 some years ago. Please, Tom. Yeah, so I just got, I hope that, something there is helpful, but yeah, Tom, please.
Thanks, Jerry.
As someone who's never really worked in academic settings, but has been a practitioner in the field, I think by focusing on universities, we're talking about the most rigid and hard to change institutions. In practice, we're working with anybody and everybody who's out in the community, including residents, but in agencies and state organizations, et cetera. And I really would be interested in hearing a little bit about the contributions, because you talked about people who have developed anti-racist praxis, and that a lot of people submitted. Because I think if we had models of practice, then half the people who graduate go into practice in community psychology. If they had tools, that may not be the right word for it, but examples of what they could do in their community that represents those values and those goals, I think we could create maybe even more change. I mean, I know we'd create more change if we changed universities, but I'm getting old. How many more years we can go at that? I think we should try it and keep pushing on it. But I'd be interested to see what we can promote in the field of praxis that people could actually take and do around the kind of change around racial justice. Is there some insights that come from the contributions that you could share? Or is that not the question?
For me, Tom, can you repeat the question?
We're talking a lot about changing the university.
Yes.
And I'm saying, if we're talking about praxis, we're talking, in my book, it's what goes on out in the community. And most people here do that. But if you do it from a university base, you've got a certain kind of security that people in the community do not. And so I'd like to know what tools there are what are the examples that people submitted of anti-racist praxis that we could disseminate. I mean, part of what happened with the competencies is they started to spread and people started to use them. Well, the same thing could happen with examples of how to do this work. And so and that I feel would go much faster. And I'm into seeing things happen. Is that any clearer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thank you for always bringing back practice. I think we tend to lose it sometimes in these conversations because it's community psychology has been more or less centered on academia. I think the issue came about is how do we train people to go out into the community, right? And then it sort of was relinquished, or if not relinquished, move more into the academic space, and then practice had to try to continuously carve out this path. So I'm saying that to say, yeah, thank you for bringing us back to that particular point. And so I do think that one of the challenges, or I think one thing that could really be looked at and is this gap between theory and practice, right? This and we're using the term praxis for this theory to practice, and but I think the challenge really lies in there. And I think about the theories that are you know, within community psychology, in particular those that we learned you know, in our courses, such as empowerment and sense of community, and you know, other theories. And I think the challenge becomes, how does it really apply to the community, right? um and if I think if we, how do I want to put this, if we mm, part of the academy, or part of teaching, part of all of that, the components within the academy has to bear in mind that what they're talking about has to be able to be applied right into the community, again, particularly in a discipline that is practice oriented. uh, so I think that's a significant place to start. Or, you know, that has, you know, we it's so much, we can't do it all. But I think if we look at where is a minuscule, where is a place where we can begin, and we can really begin there to think through the theories that are coined, and Jessica brought this up earlier, are these well, the question on the floor, it goes back to, is why haven't students learned intersectionality and you know, critical race theory, et cetera? Is where are those theories that really apply more or less to community, to people, to the lived experiences of people? And so I think it's going to take those of us who are in the community and in the academy to, you know, help to bridge that gap between those two things. And what does that look like is what we're talking about in those articles in the GJCPP. uh, Jessica, I, and Dominique have an article we're hoping will get past the peer reviews and get in there as well, where we're offering some ideas about how to bridge this gap between theory and practice. So I hope that that will be instrumental. But your point, though, Tom, is, you know, I think we could start there, is looking at that, looking at what we're saying. Does it have meaning? And interestingly, my cousin and I were talking about this the other day, and he said, you know, the issue of why we can't solve racism, he said, has to do with the fact that has to is related to theories. You know, if we talk about racism as a theory, then we don't get out there in that practice, right? And he says why? Because he calls academia intellectual performing arts, and he references that. I don't know if you've ever heard. It was my this was my first time hearing it. So I said, whoa, right? You know, to that end. And if it remains that way, we won't bridge that divide. We won't, you know, that's not going to happen. So we've just gotta. Susan and I actually were having this conversation in our first meeting on Friday about bridging this gap, basically. So I offer that definitely as at least worthy of a extended conversation, worthy of talking about.
I love that, Jerry.
Yeah.
I agree with your cousin. Like I just heard about a friend who was in a community meeting that was led by someone I would argue as performative, and this community member nearly flipped over the tables. It's like, look, y'all done brought me back to these meetings. We meeting. We're not doing anything. Like, what is going on? And I know that, you know, sometimes when we do, like, I agree, there needs to be something tangible, and that intellectual performing, the people don't connect with that. I don't connect with half, you know, it's like, speak what it is, speak truth to power, and let's move on and, you know, do what we need to do. But yeah, like I always try to think about, how is this going to translate to community, and what is, you know, how is that going to be received? And is that going to mean something? So thank you for sharing that story.
I think a lot of
Me, my bike. Yeah, thank
psychologists,
you, Kyra. Yeah, it was interesting, that's for sure. Yep, Tom, yeah, please.
a lot of community psychologists are involved in community discussions about racial disparities, and they can go far away, but we could, as community psychologists, bring focus to them, so they're focused on decoloniality and anti-racism. And so I think that's a very functional way we could do, as opposed to trying to figure out how to make that happen in the university. Give some tools to the people going out so they go into that discussion that's happening everywhere, especially with COVID, and get them to cast it in these terms.
I think too, if we're going to make a change in this arena, I've seen in foundations, I've seen in government, the funders, the power brokers that, and the people with control over resources, that this white supremacist colonizing model of doing things is the way things are done. It permeates our nonprofit sectors. It permeates, all of the systems, and somehow we need better messaging, better opportunities to show how these things, to be able to educate people in these settings more, because these conversations are really not happening in these spaces where things are being done in communities. And I don't mean in communities, I should say to communities. And I'll be honest, when we brought up, we were working with a foundation, and when we pointed out that what was happening was colonization of a community, they got angry and wanted us to take that out of reports, to not discuss, we finally had to walk away because we wouldn't be part of that, those actions. But it takes that much, and our walking away still didn't resonate, from what I understand, that the foundation stuck to its guns, that, they won't address those kinds of things. So I think in practice, our goal is to try and break down this crap that's really happening.
I realize it's now 1 o'clock, and I know Jessica has to leave. Enormous gratitude for your contribution. And Jerry, are you going to be able to stick with us? And I know a number of other people have to hop off. We're going to take the last half hour with Susan's leadership, and Jerry hopefully hopping in as much as you want to, looking at how do we translate this. So enormous gratitude to you, Jessica. That was great.
Yeah, thank you so much,
everyone. And I
Yeah,
hope that these are conversations that we can continue to have as an organization, as a discipline, and as fellow allies and accomplices, in really trying to bring racial freedom and racial justice to our community. So thank you so much. And I apologize for having to leave, but much gratitude. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I appreciate you.
Thanks,
too.
Jessica. Okay, I am more of a facilitator than a leader along these lines, and I'm definitely not the expert. My role in this, I want to be clear up front, is I need experts, which is usually just a whole bunch of people's brains, to come in and feed these conversations. I think we're all continuously, especially many of us, I was trained so many years ago before, in a more traditional model and all that. So I think that many of us are still on very much a learning path and a growth path in these areas. So I think I just want that disclaimer up front. I'm not the expert, just the facilitator, the one that will hopefully keep moving everything forward as we get multiple voices and perspectives to start to work on reforming the competencies, of course, beginning with the word competencies and all of that was one of the things I learned last week. Competencies has been a word out there and about, and we never think about how that might sound to people other than ourselves. We're so used to it being part of everything. So first of all, thinking about letting go of that as the defining word, and what other word can more comfortably to more people characterize this need to sort of come up with an idea of us having knowledge that will help us do our work better, such as understanding what does it mean to be anti-racist and what does it mean to put that into practice. In many ways in this area, we will never be competent. Even with cultural humility, you know how they still, and I still see it even on the Office of Minority Health, I still see them talking about cultural competency. And it's like, we're never competent. It's a journey. It's a consistent learning path that we're on. I like that term, cultural humility, that is often being used in the work I'm doing with the network of the National Library of Medicine. They're transitioning and they're on a learning path there as well. But so the first task will be, how do we characterize this set of current competencies? What's a better way to frame them and to talk about them? The next will be developing a new competency, for lack of a better word at this point, specifically for racial justice and anti-racist practice. And again, that will be, to me, you know, the competencies as they stand, there are these foundational ones that everybody, there's sort of the underlying knowledge, like good knowledge of ecological theories and understanding of what that means. And in this case, there's an underlying knowledge, the critical consciousness, we might call it, but there's also going to be the application, how do we turn this consciousness into how we do our work, you know, both in explicitly addressing anti-racism and in learning how not to continue upholding white supremacist ways of being, discussions, all of that. And then the third will be reviewing and revising all of the other competencies and examining them through a racial justice and anti-racist lens. Like, how do these things that we have defined for practice in our field actually contribute to continue to uphold white supremacy by definition and by design? And some of them do. I mean, we think of, I don't know, I can't think of one off the top, but many of our research methods that have been traditionally implemented are definitely racist and disempowering in just the way we do things. So that's where I'm going to leave off, and let's start with re-examining the use of the word competencies and people's ideas around that.
Hi everybody, this is Dawn. So good to see so
Dawn.
many familiar faces. Susan, thank you for that question. I had a question, like how are you really willing to interrogate terminology and go there? So how far are we willing to stretch in interrogating the term competence? And then what is the alternative term? I made the jump from higher education to nonprofit more recently. And one of the terms that is being used are strategies, right? Because strategies are the steps. It's how people do something. It is how am I applying this concept, this framework, this theory into some sort of action. Uh-oh, can you guys not hear me? I'm sorry.
There's a lot of interference. I think there's a microphone bumping up against your shirt or something. That's
It
what
may
it
be
sounds
my
like.
earring. I have some danglers.
Oh, yeah,
today.
Oh yeah, there's some connection,
sorry.
some love connection between your mic and some material
Yeah,
present
I'm
on your
sorry,
body.
because I was really into it. I was like, oh, and then
I know, I was feeling, I was like, I want to hear.
But you know, I don't. I mean, maybe the term strategy is not a term for people. You know, when we're thinking about accreditation bodies, but you know, it's being clear on what this term means. And competence is not about action. It is headspace, but it's not moving knowledge into how do I take this and live it and do it and institutionalize it. So
You just nailed why we went into this in the first place. All right.
I think in regard to how far we're willing to go, we're willing to go wherever the committee that decides to work on this decides it needs to go. I don't have any boundaries on this. I don't have any preconceived ideas. I just think this is something that needs to happen, and I don't think it's my place to decide the outcome. I think the outcome has to be the membership, and those who are doing the work defines it.
So I think one starting point, or one um, strong place, Susan, is the collective vision of the members. I think wherever we get to, I think that if we start in the right place and let it move from there. And I see Vernita, Dr. Perkins on here, and I'm going to mention her name because she's big on organic. Um, and I'm just beginning to discover organic, letting these things evolve. And so I think the starting point of, and Dawn really just articulated uh, where I really, brought it up, but I didn't have the language, or wasn't, thinking about it really in the way. I just know that competencies wasn't the going to be a different, if we continue to use that word, that wasn't going to take us in a different direction, right? Because it's going to always come back to this again, that gap between theory and practice, and that's what we're working to eliminate. And so the other thing that came up for me just this morning, I said, I don't, there's another, well, not another. I said, one of the reasons I don't like the word is because the opposite of it means incompetent. And that was a place where I said, okay, that's one reason. Yeah, that or just one other addition to another word. That we should be thinking about, because incompetent goes back to colonialism. That goes back to an ideology that's been pushed and advanced and to that end. So wanted to share that.
And the history of this is that there was no definition of what practitioners do. So in a very collaborative way, a group of people got together and tried to figure it out. And we knew right from the beginning that this would have to be changed over time. And of course, you may know that, but then they become rigidified. So I think it's all up for grabs. And the same process that started it is what we're now encouraging to be the process that re-examines it. And it's very welcome.
Yeah.
I think ultimately we want to get a group that will come together and do this. I don't plan to chair the group. I don't plan to necessarily lead the group. I'm just going to be the person that makes sure things keep moving forward. It is all my interest is. I'm kind of excited to see what a group of people can come together and do to make this evolve. So I have no idea what this could look like in the end, and no preconceived notions of what it should look like.
The other thing that I want to share, and others, this is out there, and I'm like Susan, I'm not sharing it because I think it's the only way, of course, of doing this work. But when I first saw, or when I looked at, was it when I looked at it, or just so, what I'm moving to is we're looking at anti-racist and practices, etc., and racial justice practices, and others speak up. And this isn't indicative of your ethnicity or anything to that end, but do we really need, and again, this is just a question, because I think that's how we get to the end result is, do we need to have separate points or key notes or whatever you want to call it for anti-racist racial justice work? And if so, why? Now, and here is why I bring that up, and it's a pondering point, is it centering whiteness when we do that? And Kyra says that's a good question. It's a pondering question because that may be a because whose eyes are we looking at it as, right? If we're looking at it collectively, then do we need a singling out?
Can you elaborate on that a bit more, Jerry?
So when I think about white centeredness, right, I think about it from the lens of a collective group of people who are looking through the eyes of whiteness, right? The eyes of I think Susan or someone mentioned, however you frame it, male white dominancy, heterosexual, et cetera, whatever that might look like. And so I'm wondering, when we continue to separate out key strategies, for lack of our word, that we'll think about later, are we perpetuating whiteness? Because whose eyes are, so if we're looking through a collective eyes, right, all of our eyes with different ages, different ethnicities, different diverse facets, right, in so many different ways, is it necessary to have separate key strategies, for lack of the word, for the work in anti-racist and racial justice practice? And if so, why? What is something about that I want us to grapple with, not in any way, but just putting it out there.
And I think
Does that make sense, Dawn? Is that helpful?
Well, I think how I am interpreting that, I guess this kind of goes back to the term of decolonizing versus anti-racism. And I really appreciated how Jessica said that to decolonize is kind of a broader framing, right?
Yes.
Whereas anti-racism, and I don't use racist, racism, you are particularly talking about the very inception of race, and that we are turning our eye toward disrupting and dismantling the very notion, right, of race and the very notion of racial hierarchies. And so is the question that we should kind of pan out of it and understand that there were other factors that have been the roots of even the concept of race. So race in its inception emerged from a colonized mindset. Is that kind of where you're going? Like, we need to pan out a bit so we are even moving away from that? Or that's how I'm interpreting it, Jared.
Yes, I think you're going in the right direction. And this just came up for me when I saw it written and as we're talking about it, because I think that it centers around still whose lens are we looking through when we conceptualize key strategies, or whatever you call them, right? And if we're looking through a collective lens, does the ethnicity, if others choose race or ethnicity portion, need to be separate? I mean, and why? It's separate in, say, a list, for lack of, just as we're grappling with this, like we have a list here of general competencies, or, for lack of the better word. And do we need a list over here to say specifically for anti-racism work? We should have this additional list, or list two. Because what is that saying?
Yeah, oh man.
It's an interesting thing.
Yeah, because here, and this may or may not be relative to, and please, if you guys see it differently, please say so. There is this thing that I've been fighting. I'm an administrator within the university, and something that I've noticed in the attempts at doing DEI work, they will focus the DEI work in departments where people are already doing the work. So the person who's in charge of student support services has a work in terms of DEI related to student stuff, or so there's no systemic approach to it. It's ghettoized on the backs of Black people, to be specific, who were going to do that work anyway. So now they have more labor to do to solve a bigger problem that honestly should have a bigger platform through which to solve it. So are we, when we're considering doing that work that way, are we ghettoizing it versus integrating it as it should be throughout all of the work? That's a tension, right? So are we addressing that tension through making specific call for action around change in anti-racism work? Or are we answering the call better by making sure that there is a flow of understanding of all of the ways that anti-racism needs to be integrated into practice, and how we understand our evolving notion of, for lack of a better word, competency. So what's the better route, and how do are we creating another problem by separating it versus having it integrated into everything?
I think Kara has just said something similar to that, or that aligns, Deidre, with what you shared, because I like the word embed.
Yes.
Kara says perhaps there should be consideration to develop a revised practice strategies that embeds anti-racist racial justice strategies. This will help to ensure future practice work has this at the center. When they talk about how to decenter.
That was Amber.
Oh, I'm sorry, Amber. Yeah, I'm looking at, no, Kara said something right above that. Thank you, Amber.
Thank you, Amber.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, that's huge. That's critical, because I was just gonna say that just was on the tip of my tongue to that end when I was looking at that. Embedded certainly certainly is a word that made sense when I was thinking about this. Yeah. So I'll come back to it. But Tom, I know you had, please.
Exact same thing you're saying, which is what's available is to take the overall foundational principles, add to them, change them, but certainly edit all the competencies that go below it so that they reflect this. It shouldn't be something that sits separately. We should relook at everything that we think are the competencies of being a community psychology practitioner and edit in terms of this. And then in 2 months, or we'll do the same thing and edit in terms of decoloniality, and then we'll integrate all that. But I think I think the words are there to, you can do with that as you please. Let me just make one other comment before we lose this, which is this process is absolutely unique in terms of having a collaborative approach to trying to do anything in SCRA. And so I think we need to think about how to preserve, I don't want to interrupt the flow of the topic, but how do we make sure that what goes forward, and Jerry said it so well, is reflective of this group and then many other groups that we can invite in. So we're going to need, and maybe that's one of the things we can think about as we go forward with Susan, which is what's the process by we take the wisdom that's coming out here and get it played out to others and have this become the norm in SCRA.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how the different communities of practice that are a part of SCRA are organized to connect to these larger questions. And currently they are not.
Right.
So to my thinking, it makes sense to look at that structure and how it can be changed. There's sociocracies, there are all kinds of ways that that kind of resolves that question. So thinking about a structure that can better create a flow of engagement so that there's more engaged practice and praxis amongst the different communities of practice that we have. And we have quite a few, but I think that's something worth considering.
One of the things I want to talk about at our next practice is how we can, I start my role as president in August, and I want to get things set up to do some major restructure, reformation of how we do everything in SCRA. I only have a year. So we're going to need to get, I want to start setting up systems and new ways of doing things, because I think it is a very siloed organization that's been set up with councils competing with each other over funds and everything. The budget process is like Lord of the Flies. I don't know how else to describe that, but it's all really, we need to, one of the first steps is to look at a theory of change, develop a clear theory of change, and then think about how do we make this happen? How can we get as much as possible done in the next year? While I have a position of being able to facilitate and support whatever, but I think it's time the membership, I don't have that clear vision for how things, I just know this is not working.
So that's just an advertisement, Susan, for the March 26th conversation that Susan's going to lead on that topic.
26th or 19th?
Oh, it's the 19th. I'm sorry. The 19th from 11:30 to 12:30, and you'll get notices on that. But I think that's really critical what you raised, Deidre.
Yeah, we need to start setting the foundation so that come August, we can hit the ground running. I'm thinking even things like we need to be more open with our EC meetings, this shroud of silence that, and this filtering of information needs to stop. There's just so many things in this organization that I think really need to happen to make it more open and inclusive and more functional. SCRA has a budget, people pay money, and I'm a consumer, and I come from a consumer mindset that says, what am I getting for the money I'm giving? You know, what is in it for me to even belong to this organization? How is it supporting and serving me? And I think we need to think about it all in those terms and do a major transformation of the organization while we can. So I like all the ideas that are coming out, and I think that this group and probably multiple other members have really great ideas for things we could do. We do still have some constraints. We are a division of APA, and there's good rationale for that. I know a lot of people think we shouldn't be, and I have my own days when I'm like, you know, we need to walk. But for now, they're providing us with a lot of the support we need as an organization. All of the bookkeeping support, a lot of money management stuff that in the past, when this organization didn't take advantage of that, it got itself into areas it probably shouldn't have. So I think that who knows, maybe someday this organization would be able to leave APA, but it has to be a much stronger organization than what we have now before we could ever think of breaking from the mothership. That doesn't mean we can't start pushing APA to change while we're there. But that's like a big beast of its own. But anyways, I do want to acknowledge that I know that a lot of that we may have some constraints on things, not that many, but some. We also have the constraints of being a nonprofit and all the laws that go with that. But as much as but APA doesn't tell us we have to have siloed councils for this and councils for that. I don't know, APA doesn't dictate our structure and our way of doing things. It just dictates things like how we can speak to the outside. Jean could probably give a whole dissertation. She's so knowledgeable about that. But there are some boundaries, but not that many. But I do think it's time for us. I don't know, maybe I'm old, so things like crowdsourcing and stuff, maybe y'all know how to do more of that. But we do need to make sure that whatever we do, we get as much participation from new people and new voices, because it's time to be a more open and inclusive organization. And I really think that practice and practitioners have the most potential to drive this change, because practice and practitioners work out there. They drive change in communities and everywhere else. So why can't we drive change in our own community? That's all I think I have to say about that for now.
Well, join us all on the 19th. That'll be the next conversation. Enormous gratitude to Jerry and Jessica. And we're going to hunt down the lost Dominique. And we all look forward to seeing that issue when it comes out. I think it's going to be magnificent. And I love this discussion. This is really what community psychology is in my heart, that there's a group of people who have a shared concern and we share ideas with each other. I'm going to ask Jean to save the chat. I can't remember how to do that because it's very rich. And we'll be able to maybe use that as we move forward. Also to note that they are looking for positions on many of the officers in SCRA, and I think we will be looking for a new person from practice to be a representative in SCRA executive committee. So there are places where you could be in the midst of the action and to let us know. Thank you all. Great gratitude. This is a wonderful community. Any final comments from people? Great.
Thank you, everyone, yes, for joining us today. And thank you again, Tom and Susan, for the space. And, we'll keep pushing it forward. Yep, everyone
Great.
take care. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.